They gave me the worst posting on the anchorage, and they were honest about why. I was small, I was quiet, I kept a grazing beast under my bunk, and I filed paperwork for a living. On a station that the Vorin had built to honor war, that made me the least important warm body aboard, and they did not pretend otherwise. The clerk who processed my transfer was a Vorin named Theln, broad across the shoulders the way they all were, with the gray hide and the flat black eyes and the little ceremonial blade worn at the collarbone that every adult of their kind carried whether they had ever drawn it or not. He read my file twice. He read the line about the animal 3 times. Then he looked at me over the slate and said, in the careful compact trade speech they used with the lesser species, that he wanted to be certain he understood the request. "You wish to bring a domestic predator aboard a military anchorage," he said. "She's not a predator," I said. "She's a border collie." "A herding animal." "Yes. A beast bred to move other beasts to slaughter." "To move them to pasture mostly," I said, "and back to the barn at night." He set the slate down and folded his hands and looked at me with what I would later learn was the Vorin expression for patient contempt, which involved a slight settling of the jaw, as though he were preparing to be disappointed slowly rather than all at once. "Specialist Lund," he said. "Anchorage Resh musters 9,000 crew across 4 species. We field a defense cohort that has held this sector for 200 of your years. We do not have pasture. We do not have a barn." "What precisely do you imagine your animal will move?" "Cargo manifests mostly," I said. "She lies under my desk." Theln approved the request. I think he approved it because the idea of a herding animal lying uselessly under a clerk's desk for 2 years struck him as a small and fitting humiliation. The kind of thing a Vorin of his rank could mention later dryly, to make other Vorins settle their jaws in the same way. He stamped the companion animal clause, handed me a billet in the lowest ring of the station near the cargo concourse, and told me that if the beast fouled a corridor I would clean it personally and the incident would be logged. Then he forgot about me, which was the best thing he ever did for me, though neither of us knew it yet. Nell came out of the transport crate the way she did everything, which was without fuss. She was 8 years old by then, black and white, one ear up and one ear that had never decided, with the long fine coat that picks up every scrap of straw in a county and a face that managed to look both eager and half asleep at the same time. She stepped out, stretched front and back, looked the whole strange metal world over once, and then looked at me to find out what we were doing here. That was the thing about Nell. She did not need to understand the situation. She needed to understand the job. Give her a job and she would lie down quiet for 9 hours waiting to do it, and you could have set the station on fire around her, and she would not have moved until I told her the work had changed. I had raised her from a pup on my uncle's place before the place stopped being ours, and she had worked sheep and goats, and once, memorably, a flock of geese that she did not respect, and she had a way of looking at a thing that needed moving that I have never been able to describe to anyone who has not seen it. The handlers back home called it the eye. She would drop into a low crouch head level and fix her stare on the animal she meant to move, and the animal would feel it the way you feel someone standing behind you in an empty room. She did not bark. She did not snap. She did not run at them. She simply looked and leaned the weight of her attention against them, and they went where the look told them to go. A good collie can hold 1,000 pounds of frightened you in place with nothing but patience and an unblinking stare, and then peel one animal off the flock and walk it across a field without the rest so much as lifting a head. I had stopped being amazed by it years before I ever left Earth. That, it turned out, was a failure of imagination on my part. The Vorin had no equivalent and no category for it, and so, for the first months, they simply did not see it. They saw a small Earth clerk and her small Earth beast, and the beast lay under the desk, and that confirmed everything they already believed. What the Vorin believed, broadly, was that the universe sorted itself into the strong and the food, and that the kindest thing a strong species could do for a weak one was to be honest about which it was. They were not cruel about it, exactly. Thelm would hold a door for me and then explain, helpfully, that he did so because my reflexes were too slow to be trusted near a closing hatch. The defense cohort would let me eat in their mess, and then conduct, at the next table, a loud and good-natured argument about whether a human could survive a fall that one of them had taken without comment that morning. They mocked the way a man might mock a small dog that thinks it is large, which is to say with a kind of affection that is worse than hatred because it never doubts itself. The drill master of the cohort was named Korsk, and Korsk was the one who decided early that I was funny. He was old for a Voron, scarred along the jaw, with one of the ceremonial blades worn so smooth at the grip that you could see he had actually used the thing, which made him a person of weight aboard the anchorage. He ran the muster, the great daily assembly on the lower concourse, where the cohort drilled and the cargo crews loaded, and the whole working population of the station crossed paths twice a day in a roar of bodies and machinery. The first time he saw me cross the muster floor with Nell at heel, he stopped a column of 200 armored cadets to watch. "Clerk," he called in trade speech, so that everyone would understand. "Is that the grazing beast handler?" "I'm in supply," I said. "But that is the herding animal." "That's Nell." Korsk came down off the dais with the heavy, unhurried walk of a creature that has never in its life needed to move quickly, and he crouched in front of Nell, which from a Voron is an aggressive thing, a putting of the face down at the level of the lesser creature to show it how small the gesture costs you. Nell did not back away, and she did not bristle. She sat and she looked up at him, and she did the thing she did with strangers, which was to tip her head very slightly and wait to find out whether this new large animal was part of the job or not. Korsk stared into her face for a long moment. Then he straightened and he laughed the Voron laugh, a low rhythmic huffing through the side vents of the throat, and he said to his cadets loud, "It has no teeth worth the name. It has no claws. It has a coat a child could pull out in handfuls. This," he said, gesturing at my dog, "is what Earth keeps to control its food. No wonder they breed so many of themselves. They must lose half the flock every season." The cadets huffed along with him. I stood there and said nothing, because there was nothing to say that would not make it worse, and because Nell was watching me to see if the job had changed, and I did not want to tell her it had. After a moment Korsk lost interest, the way large, confident creatures do, and the column reformed and stamped off across the concourse, and I took Nell to my desk, and she lay down under it, and we got on with 2 years of being a joke. I want to be fair to the Voron, because what happened later is not fair to them, and I do not want to pretend they were monsters. They were not. They were a people who had been right about the universe for a very long time. They had met a great many species, and most of those species had in fact turned out to be either the strong or the food, and the Voron had survived 200 years on this frontier by sorting newcomers quickly and being seldom wrong. The trouble with being seldom wrong for a very long time is that you stop checking. You develop a doctrine, and the doctrine becomes the world, and when something arrives that the doctrine has no slot for, you do not see a gap in the doctrine. You see a small clerk and her useless dog, and you go back to your work. The Voron doctrine for a panicking crowd, for instance, was very simple and had never failed them, because in 200 years they had never met a problem it could not solve. The doctrine was, contain, compress, and clear. You sealed the bulkheads to fix the boundary. You used your own armored bodies as a wall to compress the panic into a manageable volume, and you cleared the volume in ranked order, strong first, because the strong could be relied upon to keep their heads and the weak could be replaced. It was a doctrine built by and for creatures who weighed 400 kilos apiece and did not stampede, because a Voron that lost its head still outmassed the crowd around it and could simply plant its feet. It had never once occurred to them that a crowd might contain creatures who could be crushed against the wall they so helpfully provided. Why would it? On a Voron station, in a Voron cohort, everyone was a Voron. The doctrine was the world. I learned all of this afterward, slowly, the way you reconstruct an accident from the marks it leaves. At the time I knew only my own small corner of it, the manifests, the cargo schedules, the long quiet shifts on the lower ring where the freight came through. The lower concourse was the busiest single space on the anchorage and the most mixed. It was where the grain barges from the agricultural moons unloaded, and where the live cargo came through. And there was a great deal of live cargo, because the Voron and their client species ate a grazing animal called a thesson, a thing the size of a small ox, dim and docile and bred in the millions on the pasture moons, driven up the freight ramps in great soft herds and held in pens along the concourse until they were processed. The thesson were the closest thing to livestock I had seen since Earth, and I would be lying if I said I did not spend my breaks watching them. They moved like cattle, bunched like cattle, spooked like cattle. The Voron handlers moved them the way the Voron moved everything, by force and noise, and the application of overwhelming mass. 400-kilo handlers shouldering and shoving and prodding the herds up the ramps with electric goads. And it worked. But it was ugly, and it was loud, and the thesson hated it. And twice a week one of them would break and bolt and have to be run down and dragged back by 3 handlers while the herd milled and bawled and threatened to break with it. Nell watched them too. I could feel her watching under the desk the way you can feel a clock you have stopped listening to. She would lift her head when the herds came through and fix that long level stare on them through the pen rails, and her weight would shift forward onto her front paws, and she would hold there, vibrating very slightly, the way she had held at the gate of my uncle's pasture for 8 years waiting for the word that never came here. I never gave it. There was no reason to. They were not our flock and it was not our job, and a clerk's dog has no business in a freight pen. So she watched, and she waited, and the Voron shoved their thesson up the ramps with goads and curses, and none of us knew we were all rehearsing. The thing went wrong on a loading shift in the middle of the station's day, when the concourse was at its fullest. I have read the incident report. I have read several because they kept rewriting it, and the cause was a coolant line in the deck plating below the freight ramps, a thing no one would have thought about, that had been corroding quietly for a decade and chose that afternoon to fail. When it failed loudly, with a crack like a gunshot and a roar of escaping pressure, and a gout of freezing vapor that came up through the deck seams along the whole length of the ramp in a white screaming wall. It did not hurt anyone, that first burst. It was just noise and cold and the deck shuddering. But the concourse at that moment held maybe 2,000 bodies, cargo crews and transit crowds, and a full column of Kursk's cadets at muster. And it held, in the pens along the ramp, something close to 400 thesson. The thesson went first. 400 half-ton grazing animals, packed in pens, hit by a wall of screaming white cold, did the only thing 400 grazing animals have ever done in the history of anything, which is panic as one body and throw themselves at the nearest weak point in the fence. The pens were built to hold docile cargo, not a stampede. They went down like wet paper. And 400 thesson came out of the ruined pens onto a concourse packed with 2,000 people, and the people did exactly what the thesson had done, because panic does not care what species you are. They became a single animal too. They turned and they ran the only direction the concourse let them run, which was down the long throat of the lower ring toward the transit hatches at the far end. 2,000 people and 400 head of stamping livestock funneling together into a corridor built for orderly freight. And the Voron did exactly what their doctrine told them to do. I watched Kursk do it. I will give him this for the rest of my life. He did not freeze, he did not run. He did his job instantly and with total confidence, and his job was wrong. He bellowed the containment order. The bulkheads began to drop, the great blast doors that sealed the ring into segments, and the cadets, 200 of them, moved to form the wall, ranking up across the concourse to compress the panic into a manageable volume, 400-kilo armored bodies planting their feet to make a dam. I understood it a half-second before it happened, the way you understand a glass is going to fall after your hand has already knocked it. The bulkheads were dropping at the far end. The wall of cadets was forming behind. and 2,000 people and 400 Thesson were running full tilt into the closing space between them, a space that was getting smaller from both ends at once, and the soft small bodies in that crowd, the human dock crew, the slight client species clerks, the children, because there were children, families lived on the lower ring. Those bodies were going to be driven into the legs of stamping livestock and the planted feet of the cadets and the descending edge of a blast door. And the Doctrine, the perfect 200-year-old Doctrine, was going to compress them all into a paste and call it a successful containment. I have thought a great deal in the years since about why I did what I did, and the honest answer is that I did not decide anything. There was no decision in it. I had spent 8 years on a pasture and 2 years under a desk watching a herd come apart, and some part of me older than thought simply recognized the shape of the disaster and reached for the only tool I had ever owned that fit it. I did not think, this will save them. I thought, that flock is breaking and I have a dog. I got up onto my desk so she could see me over the rails, and I gave Nell the word. I had not given her the word in 2 years. I gave it the way I had given it 10,000 times on my uncle's place, 2 short notes in her name, the come-by whistle that sends a collie out wide to the right and around the head of the flock. And I will tell you that the moment the whistle left my mouth I felt 8 years old, standing at a gate in the rain, and the metal and the screaming and the alien sky fell away, and there was just the work, the oldest work there is, the work my species learned before we learned to write. Nell came out from under the desk like she had been fired from it. I need you to understand what a working collie is, because the Voron did not understand it, and that is the whole of the story. A collie does not herd by being fierce. A wolf is fierce. A wolf scatters a flock and pulls down the slow one, and that is the opposite of herding. A collie herds by being the controlled threat of a wolf, and then withholding it forever with perfect patience, by carrying the shape of a predator into the middle of a flock, and then refusing with its whole disciplined body to be one. The flock feels the wolf and moves away from it. The dog uses that movement and shapes it. And the dog's entire art, the thing 8,000 years of breeding has refined, is the art of pressure without contact, of moving 1,000 panicking bodies exactly where they need to go by being in precisely the right place at precisely the right moment and never, ever touching a single one. The calm is not the absence of the threat. The calm is the threat, mastered. That is what no one on that station could see. They thought the danger in my dog was her teeth. The danger in my dog was that she had been bred for 400 generations to do the one thing their entire doctrine could not do, which was to move a panic gently. She ran the outrun. She went out wide and low along the edge of the concourse, away from the crowd, the way she had been bred to, never straight at the flock, never adding her own rush to the rush, but arcing out and around to come at the head of the stampede from the front, where a herder needs to be. She was a black and white blur a quarter the size of a single Thesson running into the path of 400 of them, and Korsk saw her, and Korsk shouted something that I did not need translated, something that meant get that thing out of there before it is paced. And then Nell reached the head of the stampede and dropped into the eye. She planted herself in the throat of the corridor, directly in the path of the lead Thesson, dropped her front end low, leveled her head and stared. And the stampede slowed. It did not stop. You cannot stop 400 head with one dog. No one has ever claimed you could. But the lead animals felt the eye, felt the small fixed predator standing its ground in their path with that terrible unblinking patience. And they did the thing prey has done since the first prey, which is hesitate, just a heartbeat, just enough. They checked, they swung, they looked for the way around the wolf instead of through it. And Nell was already moving, flowing along the front of the herd, holding the eye, turning the lead animals a few degrees, then a few more, peeling the head of the stampede away from the closing bulkhead and the planted cadets and bending it. Gently, gently, with nothing but her body and her stare and 200 years of instinct against their 200 years of doctrine, bending the whole roaring mass into the open freight bay on the concourse's flank, the one space large enough to swallow it. The one space the panicking crowd's own bodies had been blocking until the livestock turned, and the people, following the livestock the way panicked people follow anything that looks like it knows where it's going, turned with them. I was whistling the whole time. I want that on the record because the Voron left it out of every report. I was standing on a clerk's desk in the middle of the worst hour of my life, whistling a sheep dog around a stampede in the come by and the away and the steady. The same four sounds shepherds have made on every hillside on earth for longer than any of us have had countries. And across 200 meters of screaming chaos, a half-asleep 8-year-old farm dog heard them and obeyed them, because that was the job, and I had finally given her the job. It took her 90 seconds. I have timed it against the deck logs. 90 seconds from the come-by to the moment the last of the herd poured into the freight bay, and the crowd flooded after it into the open space, and the crush in the corridor simply released, the pressure bleeding off as 2,000 bodies found somewhere to go that was not into each other. The bulkheads had stopped dropping. Someone had finally overridden the containment order. The cadets stood in their useless wall with their feet planted, staring. And in the mouth of the freight bay, one small black and white dog walked back and forth, low and level, holding 400 head of livestock and 2,000 people bunched and quiet and waiting with nothing but the weight of her attention, exactly the way she had held my uncle's ewes at the pasture gate 100 lifetimes ago. I climbed down off the desk and walked out across the concourse. The whole station was silent except for the lowing of the Thesson settling and the hiss of the dead coolant line. 2,000 faces watched me cross that floor, and I did not look at any of them. I walked up to the edge of the freight bay and I looked at my dog, and she looked at me, panting, her one good ear up, asking the only question she ever asked, which was whether the job was done or whether there was more. I said, "That'll do, Nell." And she came off the herd. She turned her back on 400 half-ton animals as if they had ceased to exist the instant I released her, and she trotted over to me, and she sat down on my foot the way she always had, leaning her weight against my leg, and she looked up with her tongue out and her tail going slowly across the deck plating, and that was the end of it, as far as she was concerned. The job was done. She had no idea she had just dismantled 200 years of military doctrine. She wanted to know if there was a biscuit. There was not, at that moment, a biscuit. There was, instead, the entire surviving population of the lower concourse standing in absolute silence, watching a clerk crouch down to scratch the chest of a grazing beast handler's useless dog. And then, at the back, one of the cadets started the low, huffing rhythm of the Voron throat, but it was not the laugh. I had heard the laugh for 2 years, and this was not it. It was slower and deeper, and it spread, cadet to cadet, handler to handler, down the whole length of the ruined concourse, until 200 armored warriors and 1,000 workers were making a sound I had never heard a Voron make. And I did not know what it was, and I was afraid of it, the way you are afraid of any large reaction you cannot read. Kursk came down off the dais. He crossed the concourse slowly, the heavy, unhurried walk, and he stopped in front of me and looked down at the dog, and the dog looked up at him and tipped her head very slightly, the way she had the first day, waiting to find out whether this large animal was part of the job. And Kursk, the drill master, the scarred old killer who had told 200 cadets that this was what Earth kept to control its food, Kursk lowered himself down into the crouch, the aggressive crouch, the face brought down to the level of the lesser creature, except that there was nothing aggressive in it now. He brought his scarred face down level with Nell's, and he was quiet for a long time. Then he said very softly in trade speech, not to me, to her, "I did not see you." And the huffing sound rolled down the concourse, and I understood at last that it was not a laugh. The Voron had a sound for the laugh and a different sound, from deeper in the throat, for the thing a warrior is supposed to feel and almost never does. The recognition that one has been wrong about the location of the danger in the room. It was not applause. They did not have applause. It was the sound of 200 warriors revising the world. The inquiry took a month. The Voron take their failures seriously. which is the other half of why they had been right for 200 years, and the coolant line and the containment order and the 11 seconds between the bulkheads beginning to drop and the override being thrown were dissected by serious creatures in a serious room, and I was made to give my account 4 times. What they could not get past, what they came back to in every session, was the 90 seconds. They had logs of it. They had it from 40 angles, and the part that broke their understanding was not that the dog had turned the stampede. They could see, once it was pointed out, the brute physics of it, the lead animals checking, the head of the herd bending. The part they could not absorb was that she had done it without touching anything. 2,000 lives, 400 head, the worst panic in the station's history, resolved to a quiet bunched herd in a freight bay, and not one animal so much as nipped, not one body bruised by the dog, not one contact at all. Their entire science of crowds was a science of contact, of walls and compression and overwhelming mass. The idea of moving a panic by being a controlled threat that never lands had no place in their thinking. It was, to them, very nearly magic, and the Voron do not believe in magic, and so they did the most Voron thing imaginable. They decided to learn it. I was summoned, near the end of that month, to a room I had never been allowed into, full of Voron of a rank I had never spoken to, and an old officer with 3 of the ceremonial blades at her collar told me formally that the cohort wished to study the methods of the earth-herding animal with a view to incorporating them into doctrine, and that my cooperation was requested. She said request the way Theln had once said request, except that this time it meant the opposite. This time it meant please. So I taught them. It is the strangest thing I have ever done, and I will be telling it on my deathbed. For the better part of a year, I stood on the muster floor of Anchorage Resh, and explained the 8,000-year-old craft of the British Hill, shepherd to a cohort of 400-kilo alien warriors who wrote down every word. I explained the outrun, that you never run straight at the panic, that you go wide and come at its head, that adding your own rush to the rush is the one unforgivable error, which happened to be the precise error their doctrine had been built on. I explained that the goal is to be the controlled threat and then withhold it forever, that the calm is not weakness but the threat mastered, that a frightened thing will move away from a steady predator and toward a frantic one, and that everything depends on which one you choose to be. I explained pressure and release, that you move a body by leaning your attention against it, and you stop it by lifting that attention away, that the whole art is knowing exactly how much and exactly when. I explained that you cannot herd what you are willing to harm, because the instant you harm one the rest learn that you are a wolf and not a shepherd, and then you will never move them gently again. That last one was the one that landed. I watched it land. I had said it offhand, the way my uncle had said it to me. You cannot drive what you'd hurt, and the old 3-bladed officer went very still, and I realized I had told a culture of warriors that their entire doctrine of force had been making their crowds harder to move, not easier, that 200 years of contain and compress and clear had been teaching every panic on every Voron station that the armored wall was a wolf, and that the panic had been throwing itself against that wall not despite the wall but because of it. The Voron do not flinch. She did not flinch, but she wrote it down and underlined it, and I understood that something very large was being rebuilt in that room and that I, a clerk, a joke, the least important warm body aboard, was holding the chisel. They codified it in the end the way the Voron codify everything, with total seriousness and no humor whatsoever, which is the funniest thing about the entire affair, and the reason it has become, in certain quiet circles, a legend. The defense cohort of Anchorage Resh adopted a new crowd management doctrine, ratified by the High Command, taught now to every cadet across the sector. They wrote it down at length. I am told the final document runs to many pages with diagrams. They gave its principals names, the way they name everything, in the high formal register reserved for sacred things and combat maneuvers, which to a Voron are the same register. The outrun became the wide approach. The I became held pressure. The fundamental law, you cannot drive what you'd hurt, they rendered into their own tongue as a single hard phrase that the cadets now recite, and which translates roughly as the wall that strikes is the wall they break. And the doctrine as a whole, the entire body of it, the thing 200 Vorin cadets now train in twice a week on the muster floor where Kursk once stopped a column to laugh at my dog. The doctrine as a whole they named, with great solemnity, after the manner of the animal that had taught it to them. There is no Vorin word for a border collie. There is no Vorin word for a shepherd. So they built one, out of the closest concepts they had, and the official name of the crowd-control doctrine of the Resh defense cohort, the maneuver their warriors are proudest to have mastered, the thing they will tell you about if you ever buy one a drink, translates into trade speech as the gentle drive. Kursk learned it first and learned it best, which did not surprise me, because the creatures who are most certain of the world are sometimes the ones most relieved to be shown a better one. He came to me privately, once, near the end, after a drill in which he had moved a simulated panic of 200 cadets across the muster floor and into a holding bay without a single contact, the wide approach and the held pressure executed by a scarred old warrior, with the patience he had spent his whole life believing was the opposite of strength. He stood by my desk where Nell lay in her usual spot, and he was quiet, and then he said that he had drilled the maneuver 400 times and could now move a crowd as gently as the animal had, and that he wished me to confirm something. He wished me to confirm that he had it right. I told him it was good work. It was. He had the wide approach and he had the pressure and the release, and he was a fine handler for a creature with no instinct for it at all, which is a higher compliment than it sounds. But there was one thing, I said, that he did not have and would never have, and that no amount of drill would give him, and that it was only fair he should know it. He asked what it was. I looked down at Nell, asleep under the desk, one ear up even in sleep, dreaming whatever it is collies dream, sheep. I always assumed, an endless green hillside and a flock that never settles and a gate that is always about to open. And I told Kursk the truth, the only piece of it that ever mattered, the thing the whole long strange business came down to in the end. I told him that he had learned to move a panic gently, and that this was a fine and rare and difficult thing, and that he should be proud of it, but that he had learned it. He had drilled it into himself 400 times against his every instinct, a warrior forcing his nature into a shape it did not want to take, and it would always be work for him, deliberate and conscious, a thing he did. The dog, I said, did not learn it. She was made of it. 8,000 years before either of our peoples could write, mine had taken a wolf and bred the rush out of it, and the patience in, generation on generation, until the controlled threat that withholds itself forever was not a maneuver the animal performed but the animal itself, asleep, dreaming, under a clerk's desk on a station at the edge of nowhere. He had spent a year and 400 drills learning to do, badly and on purpose, the smallest part of what she was without trying, without knowing she was anything at all. That, I told him, is the thing you cannot drill. You can copy what she does. You will never be what she is. We have been making her for longer than we have been making history. She is the oldest tool we own, and she is the gentlest one, and we kept her to move our food to better grass. You thought that made us weak. Kursk looked at the sleeping dog for a long time. Then he settled his jaw, the old expression, except that it meant something different now, something closer to respect than I would ever have thought that face could hold, and he said that he understood and that he would tell the cadets, and he did, and it is in the doctrine now in the formal register, a line they recite that translates as, "We learned the gentle drive in a year. They were the gentle drive before the stars cooled. Remember which of you is the student." I served out my posting. I filed my manifests. Nell lay under the desk, and twice a week she lifted her head to watch Kursk's cohort drill the maneuver she had taught them, and I will never know, but I think that she approved. In the dim, contented way she approved of any flock that moved as it should. We went home when the 2 years were up. She died on earth, old and gray and asleep in the sun, on grass, which is where a working dog ought to die, and I buried her on what was left of my uncle's place at the gate. But I will tell you what stayed with me, the thing I think about. It is not the 90 seconds, though I think about those. It is the name. Of all the things that great serious warlike people could have called the doctrine that a farm dog taught them, they could have named it for the cohort, or for the inquiry, or for the dead coolant line, or for nothing at all, a numbered procedure in a numbered manual. And instead a culture that sorted the universe into the strong and the food chose to name their proudest maneuver after the small toothless thing they had laughed at, and to render that name not in the language of force but in the language they kept for sacred things. The gentle drive. They did not name it for the wolf. They named it for the dog who chose, every minute of every day for 8,000 years, not to be one. That was the part the Voron got right in the end when they finally saw her. The danger was never the teeth. The danger was the calm. And the calm, it turns out, is the harder thing to be, and the rarer thing to keep, and the only thing in that whole roaring corridor that moved 2,000 frightened souls to safety without leaving a mark. She'd have herded geese for it if I'd asked. She never did respect the geese, but she'd have done it because it was the job, and I'd have only had to say the word. That'll do.